issued formal notice that all of the grants awarded directly to the institutions will be automatically extended. The performance period will be extended. So the institutions originally had through the end of this current June of this current year to spend all these dollars and execute. They now will automatically, the performance period will be extended to June of next year. So essentially they have another year to spend those dollars. There is some survey data included in the docket item from last fall from the American Council on Education that just speaks in general about how effective these dollars have been in supporting our students through the pandemic. And so I'll note that for you. And then, of course, later in the appendix, we talk a little bit about all the uses that these institutions can apply the funding for. There was guidance earlier this spring that came from the Department of Education allowing the institutions to devote more of the resources to supporting students in non-traditional ways for housing insecurity, food insecurity, and other uses. And so we hope that the institutions are going to continue to employ those dollars to the benefit of their students. And so that's the update I have for you. I'll pause there for questions or comments that folks may have.
Questions?
Jim, this is Frank, is the deadline that you just mentioned, June of 2023, is that for both the student and the institution funds of the ARPA part of HERF?
It is correct, yes.
Okay.
And I appreciate you asking that question for no other reason than I know some of those listening on the line may not be too familiar. So HERF does include a student portion that is to be spent directly on student needs and an institutional portion, roughly half and half. And both portions then do apply to that extension.
And the roughly half and half, I remember that was true of the first of the three federal, the major one. The third one was the largest one nationwide. That wasn't necessarily half and half, though, correct? The third one, the large one, nicknamed ARPA.
Yeah, that is true. I think the first tranche was a straight up 50-50, and then subsequent tranches were a little bit different. I think it's more like a 55-45 now, but I think most of the institutions are certainly treating it like 50-50. I'll also add that the institutional portion, some of that funding, and it's anywhere dependent upon the institution, the institutions can use that for additional student support. So many of the institutions of their own accord are using those dollars to, provide tuition refunds earlier during the pandemic, devote those resources to additional student supports. And so I don't have a whole lot of detail on exactly how much by institution. I can tell you that under federal rules, each institution is required to report the use of these dollars and post the use of these dollars on their website. And many of them do have pretty robust and detailed information on their website that speaks to exactly how many dollars they used for what purpose. So.
Okay, and then lastly, the June 30, 2023 deadline, is that a deadline to spend, or is that a deadline to decide how to spend? I'm thinking, all right, in June 2023, we have to spend every last penny, or do we have to have a plan in place to have to spend every last penny by, say, I'll just say June 30, 2024, at the end of the FY24 fiscal year? Do you know that little detail or not?
My understanding is that it's for actual performance, as in thou shalt have the money actually spent by that time frame. I can tell you, though, that DOE in different venues has indicated a willingness to work with institutions. Okay. So that's a way of saying if you have a plan and if you if you have a plan, a detailed plan to support your students with this funding, we sure want you to use the funding for that purpose. So I would be surprised if institutions who needed a little extra time on the clock were not getting that consideration from DOE. And of course, they need to ask DOE because the grant is between them and DOE.
And DOE meaning Department of Education,
Correct.
national,
Yes.
Federal or state?
Federal. These are federal dollars. They bypassed us. We didn't have really anything to do with it.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Yeah, you bet.
Commissioner Hayman? You're muted.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. Jim, I was wondering if you had any sort of anecdotal information that would help us to better understand the significant difference between institutions in terms of their levels of spending to date.
I appreciate the question. I wish I had the opportunity to spend more time kind of following up with institutions directly. I can share that there is a broad application available for these dollars. So the institutions, which is, I think, a great feature of these federal programs, the institutions can use this money to help the student pay for tuition and fees. The student portion, by the way, has to get sent to the student. The institution cannot keep that money. They have literally, under the federal rules, they have to send that money out to the student. And that created, of course, some issues where some of the students are like, why can't you just apply this to my account? Well, under federal rules, we have to write you a check. Then you have to endorse that check back to a little weird. But the institution share of the funding can be used to pay for students' books. It can be used for childcare. It can be used for different purposes, for housing expenses. So you can think of it as like a Pell where the student can use that funding to spend their share, the student's share, on any cost of attendance, category of spending. The institution, in addition, can also provide that money to students for childcare, for other sources. So what we're seeing is that some institutions have essentially targeted that funding to their Pell eligible students. They kind of made it easy on themselves and said, well, hey, we know that Pell designation does a great job of identifying those students in need. Let's piggyback on that, not reinvent the wheel. We have seen some other institutions, especially the community colleges, take a bit of a different approach where they know for their student populations, childcare or lack thereof is a bigger impediment to that student's educational journey. So they're actually targeting those students to that purpose. And so how they're choosing to do that varies slightly. The 20 to 25% of funding that remains unspent, many of the institutions have strategically kept some of their powder dry, as it were. They've kept some of that money in reserve so they could apply it term by term and make sure that their neediest students continue to receive ongoing support. So that's why I think we're seeing that there's still that 20-25% of funding left. I can briefly also tell you for institutional stakeholders listening to this, we have heard on the Hill at the federal level, there's a bipartisan effort to reclaim some of that unspent money. So I know that the word is getting out to our institutions, but I would piggyback on that and encourage them to think about what that may mean for their institution and their students.
Thanks, Jim. That was part of the reason that I asked that question.
I thought it might be.
Thank you both. Any other questions? Okay. Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize. I'm a little distracted in trying to get our panelists in the meeting, and I am having technological challenges in doing so. I am been told, Karen, that one of them is in the waiting room still, but I don't see anybody in our waiting room. So maybe I can get some assistance with that. With that, Madam
When
Chair,
we've, yeah, let me
go ahead.
see if I can help here. I would just encourage if we can let anybody who's having trouble getting into the meeting know that they should try logging out and reusing the link. On occasion, that has been an issue for folks trying to log into Teams, but I'm also not seeing anybody requesting admission to the meeting who has not been admitted. And Madam Chair, we may just have to take a pause while we try to assemble the panel here.
No,
The good news too, Madam Chair, is that in an effort to be efficient with time, I do think that Tom Reel and I are ready to cover the 23-25 agency budget development, potential pops, and so we could move to item 5.0 while we're doing that.
that's fine, but does that prevent you, Carolyn and Ben, can you handle the trying to get the others in if Jim moves to the pop?
Yeah, I'm happy to work
I also
on it.
don't mind waiting a minute.
I'm happy to work. Is it Jim? Is it Martha who can't get in?
Correct.
Okay, I'll see if I can get a hold of her. Thanks.
She told me, Ben, that she's trying to call in.
Okay.
And Karen, I have sent her the invite, and I've also shared the link to her as well, with her as well. And I see one of our panelists, Dr. Daisy Gonzalez from our friends in California, is joining us, and so we do have Daisy and her amazing story as well. But I think, Madam Chair, with your permission, I think Tom is here, my friend Tom Reel, my colleague, and so we can start there. I'll turn it to him.
Okay, we're playing hopscotch with the agenda, which is fine. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair Rao. For the record, my name is Tom Reel, and I'm the Director of Operations at HAC. And today I'm going to be talking to you about where we are at in the agency requested budget process. I'm going to deliver a brief overview of the statewide process, and then talk about what we're emphasizing this budget season. And then we're going to go over some of our preliminary legislative concepts and policy option packages we've gathered. The statewide process has 3 steps. First is the agency requested budget, which is due to the Department of Admin Services and the governors by September 1st. Then the next development process is done by the governor's office in consultation with agencies, and he or she puts together the governor's requested budget, which in January, February goes to the legislature, and in June, July, we end up with our legislatively adopted budget. So that's a brief overview of the statewide process. It is over a year long, and we have just started today. Well, not today, we started a couple of weeks ago with our agency requested budget. And that has 2 components. The first is what we call current service levels. We take our existing programs that are going to be continuing, and we make adjustments to them based on inflation and some other factors, and we put together our 23-25 current service level budget. On top of that, we add to it policy option packages, which are new budget items. They could be an expansion of programs, or they could be brand new programs, which to serve the people, our constituents. We also put together legislative concepts, which are changes in laws. And the legislative concepts and policy option packages sometimes go hand in hand. For example, if we have a brand new program that's going to need more funds, we will have a policy option package, and we will probably need new authority. We'll need new laws so that we could use that money. Sometimes they're separate. If it's a legislative concept that is just a change in law with no fiscal impact, that would stand alone. And likewise, some policy option packages are just an expansion of existing program where we already have the authority. So those would stand alone. And what we're emphasizing this budget season is outreach, particularly outreach to student organizations, business organizations, community organization groups, community-based organization groups that are representing Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Those that have an interest in our work. And so for the next 2 months, our staff has made a commitment to go out and reach out to all sorts of these organizations and entities and hear their feedback. We'll be sharing our legislative concepts or policy option packages. And I want to emphasize it is really early in the process. This list will get winnowed down as we go through. And today we're sharing it with you as we have gathered it. We have not vetted it. We have not prioritized it. It is a list of what our stakeholders have given us so far, what our staff has gathered. And what I'm gonna now ask Ramona to come on and talk about our legislative concepts.
Hi. Sorry, my camera was blocked. I'm not actually invisible. Thank you. The legislative concepts we have our first due date for legislative concepts actually this week at the end of the week. And so at this point, we think we have a little over a dozen of them. Most of them, as Tom said, are really placeholders at this point because we are in the process of going out and getting, doing some outreach and getting some feedback on those ideas so that we can make sure that we incorporate that feedback into our final request for statutory changes. The dozen or so that we have are a mix of everything from some pretty routine housekeeping measures. I'd say about half of the proposals that we have fall into that category. New programs and modifications to existing laws. As times and circumstances change, we need to ensure that our laws remain current and relevant. That's really where the housekeeping measures come into play. We want to make sure we're providing clarity to the people who are accessing programs. So to give you an overview of the housekeeping measures, I'm going to kind of zip through these really quickly. They include things like revising the law so that it's clear that all colleges are accredited by the U.S. Department of Education. We're effectively going to remove the regional accreditation distinction from the law. Since instead of having two processes, we have one. We don't want to confuse the issue by making it look like we're doing different things for different types of organizations. Next, we are going to be trying to work to shift our cosmetology curriculum approval to Oregon Health Licensing, where it fits better with what it is that they do. We do not approve curriculum for most private career schools, or actually any other than the cosmetology. And so that one basically was a transfer from ODE, and it no longer fits with the structures that
volume on this thing.
We are moving our Oregon degree authorization statutes out of the OSAC statutes, the student access and completion. They're just placed in the wrong place. And then one of the other ones that is important to our Office of Workforce Initiatives is we're trying to consolidate 3 youth boards that currently exist, and that's the Oregon Conservation Corps, the Oregon Youth Employment Program, and Oregon Youth Conservation into one board structure instead of 3, so that those programs can be working more hand in hand and be advised by the same board, and we would be calling that the Youth Works Board. Another one that involves another state agency is the Future Ready Oregon program. Was signed into law very recently, and it placed most of the apprenticeship programs into the Bureau of Labor and Industries. And so we're asking to put one of our Workforce Talent Development Board members onto their State Apprenticeship and Training Council board. And so that's another proposal. We are wanting to clean up veterans' tuition policies to provide clarity and to remove contradictions in the law. And we're also looking at one additional statute so that we can make sure that it allows grants to be made to early education specialists, not only just in the education field, but also in the behavior and mental health professional realm. So those are really more of our housekeeping type measures that we're proposing. The rest are new programs or modifications. One of our most visible new programs that we need to create some statutory language for is the new Tribal Student Grant Program. We received about $19 million in the short session to offer some fairly large grants to members of Oregon registered tribes. And we received this money through a special purpose appropriation, and it was not written into law. So in order to establish that program, we're really seeking to move it from being created within our own rules into Oregon law, so that and that allows it to continue into the future, and to ensure a degree of stability for those students who would be receiving that grant. We are also considering amending the Oregon Promise statutes to remove accelerated credit discount, and also to potentially open it up to include eligibility to any post-secondary institution, not just community colleges. But as I said, these are still under discussion. We're still seeking input for these ideas, but those are the ideas that are on the table right now for Oregon Promise. For Oregon Opportunity Grant, we're looking to remove the restrictions of having to attend either half or full-time enrollment, to make it accessible to non-Title IV schools in the CTE and apprenticeship program fields, and also to reward persistence in degree completion. So those are mainly the legislative concepts that are being proposed around our grant programs. Some of the other new ones are we are considering a legislative concept to cease the practice of withholding transcripts from students for unpaid fees. That's something that other states have done and wanted to, so it's one of the ideas on the table for consideration in the coming session. Another one that is on the table from our Office of Workforce Initiatives is to provide some matching dollars for the AmeriCorps members who receive already a federal education grant, but this one would be essentially trying to keep those students in Oregon to have them pursue either continue their undergraduate or graduate degrees without having to leave the state. And lastly, one of the ones that that I think will garner a lot of conversation in the coming days is really the conversation of taking the idea of guaranteed admissions policy and putting that into statute. That's really creating a law by which any high school student who meets a certain certain level of criteria that's established is accepted when they graduate to a university when they meet that established criteria. We know that 12 states already have programs like this, and they vary depending on the states. We don't have any particular criteria outlined at this point, but we are wanting to stimulate that conversation in the coming days to see if that is a legislative concept that ultimately we want to propose as a major new policy direction for Oregon. And I think that really concludes most of the legislative concepts that we have on the table right now. We have until June 8th to finalize these. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversation. We are also very much interested in what your feedback on these ideas would be, but more to come on it. That's really just what's on the list to date.
Thank you, Tom and Ramona. Ben, did you want to say something?
Yeah, if I could, about timeline and process and the commission's role, both with respect to the policy option packages and legislative concepts. There's always been a dance because obviously much of the work is done by staff and done in accordance with Department of Administrative Services deadlines that don't always match up very neatly with commission meeting schedules and the opportunity to get kind of guidance and input from and direction from commissioners. Ramona mentioned a couple of those deadlines. One as it related to sort of filing placeholder titles for potential legislative concepts that's this week, another that's in June for fleshing them out more deeply. As it relates to legislative concepts specifically, historically, we have kept the commission updated on our thinking and our recommendations over the course of the even numbered year, and engage the commission in a decision about whether to move forward officially with a recommendation to the governor that she, or in the case of an incoming governor, she or he, approve the final kind of submission of legislative concepts to the legislature in the fall. So that vote, as it will, or if we, assuming we stick to the same process, that vote would occur likely in October or November, prior to the governor's final decision about whether to move forward. But after we've done a lot of the work in fleshing them out, even working with legislative counsel, the attorneys that draft the bills. So we need your feedback along the way, and we need your final vote before making that ultimate recommendation to the governor about whether to move these concepts forward. The POPs, it's similar insofar as we're working against these internal deadlines. We ask for the commission's final endorsement of our agency request budget at our August meeting in advance of that September 1st internal Department of Administrative Services deadline for submitting the agency request budget. In reality, by August, we've already done a lot of the technical work and some of the real substantive work in writing up the policy option packages, naming them, putting costs to them. We've completed a current service level budget. So meetings like this month's and next month's and June's are your primary opportunities, especially with the policy option packages, to provide feedback, to give us, a sense of what should be a priority, what should not, what may be missing. And hopefully we minimize the need of the commission in August to say, whoa, that's a really bad idea. Because it becomes very difficult for us in August to reverse the work that we will have already been submitting through these internal systems, starting earlier in the summer, really in June. So it's a back and forth, but conversations like today's are really important for driving the direction that we take against some of these internal deadlines before presenting you with a final recommendation for adoption.
And I should have clarified that June 8th deadline just is the date to move it from being a placeholder to having some actual proposed language to submit to Legislative Council. So, so I wasn't very clear about that. I apologize. Greg, do you have a question? Your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Ramona. Appreciate this, and I find this whole process intriguing, looking at it from a different perspective than I have historically. I would like, with regards to our state-funded student financial aid, for us to consider a policy or legislative concept that would, the net effect would be to defund the Oregon Promise and move those resources over into the Oregon Opportunity Grant, and at the same time substantially increase the funding of that grant. As glad to have a longer conversation about that, but I believe that is our most effective tool in putting resources in the hands of those who are most economically disadvantaged, and I think it would serve as a powerful tool for us to achieve our equity agenda. So.
Yes, just 1 minute, and before you answer that or address it, and perhaps Senator Devlin can address it too, from Commissioner Hayman, I wanted to add to that, build on that question. It's hard to tell, I realize this is the pre-draft draft, but it's hard to tell whether on the financial aid to students, how ambitious we intend to be this session. And that's always been top of mind for all of us. So if you could give a little more context or background on at this point, how ambitious you think that package will be, and then perhaps we can discuss Commissioner Hayman's idea.
I will certainly give it a try. I think at this point in the process, particularly the concepts around the Oregon Promise and the Oregon Opportunity Grant are definitely placeholders. That is to say that that there are a lot of different ideas on the table, and so including everything from some minor tweaks to the language that would basically enable us to serve the students who have the most demonstrated need, to restructuring the program entirely. And so at this point, I think all we have really done in those placeholders is to identify the areas that we think have potential for improvement, but we haven't chosen a particular direction. That's really the place where we need some input from a lot of the stakeholder groups that we ordinarily work with, everything from our work groups who look at financial aid and who advise us on that topic specifically, to the universities, to the colleges, all from this, and also definitely the students and the commission as well. And so I think at this point, all we know is that those are areas that historically we absolutely do want to have the ability to make some policy change recommendations. I don't think we've identified exactly what those are at this point. And the only thing we've really detailed are probably the ones that are more minor in nature.
Commissioner Cindy, go ahead, please, Commissioner Devlin.
Madam Chair, I would hope that we could have a much longer discussion about this in terms of the Oregon Opportunity Grant and Oregon Promise. Oregon Promise has actually had a pretty significant level of support in the legislature. So a abrupt change might be very difficult to get through the legislature. I'm not saying that it couldn't occur, but I'm also saying it would be an assumption on our part to say if it went away, that those dollars would automatically go into the Oregon Opportunity Grant. The other thing that I think we could have a discussion about is when we talked about the Oregon Opportunity Grant and its transitions probably more than a decade ago, and there was this discussion of the shared responsibility model. The underlying concept wasn't just to meet the needs of those in most need. It was to fully recognize that a lot of students were being artificially barred from a higher education, who were actually members of families that were basically working class families in Oregon. Now, the Opportunity Grant is probably far away in level of appropriation from what it would take to meet the original intent of the shared responsibility model. But it would be interesting to see if there was any analysis of how far we are away from that. So I don't have to interject here so many times. The one thing I wanted to comment on also, maybe Ben could comment or one of the other speakers, we are in a unique circumstance right now because it hasn't occurred for probably 16 years, is that HEC as a state agency will follow the normal standard process. But there is a new portion of the process that hasn't occurred for 16 years, and that is a new governor. When Governor Brown, Secretary of State Brown took over for Governor Kitzhaber, when he resigned, that was already into the session. But a new governor coming on will have the ability to change the governor's recommended budget. And this will be the first time actually in 16 years that has occurred. The last time was between Kitzhaber and Kulongowski. And I can't remember how much Kulongowski changed, but it happens very rarely. But it's a very quick The new governor doesn't have very much time to make those changes, but they do have a little bit of time. But I would think that the agency would be prepared for that. So I just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you very much for both of those important points. Jim and Ben and Ramona, is there time either at the next meeting that we can set aside for a specific discussion of both the Opportunity Grant and Oregon Promise, and to answer Commissioner Devlin's point about seeing how far from original intent and from maximum beneficial impact we are? I know we did that, I think last year, or certainly the year before, when we were looking at our comparison on funding, helping to fund potential students compared to what Washington State had done in their budget, for example. So I also think, in addition to seeing where we are on our trajectory and the effectiveness, potentially looking at another example or two where funding specifically is going to help working class, middle class, and students most in need might be very helpful. And then our input could help you shape this more. I think we're all on the same page. I would just hate to get too far down the road and for us to have wished that we had pushed further.
I will say that we're talking to you earlier than we ever have before, and we're trying to introduce these ideas for exactly that purpose, so that we can involve you as these concepts are being created, as opposed to just getting feedback on something that's already mostly baked. And it's ordinarily, when we've presented this list before, it tends to be a much more finalized list, and it tends to be a lot closer to August. So, I believe that we do want to encourage that conversation and to make sure that we get feedback. And I am at this point just really telling you, as Tom, our new director of operations, said, these are not fully vetted ideas yet. They are the things that are on really what I would call the brainstorming list, and they need refinement. And we're seeking to get those ideas from you and from other people who have more knowledge about how this will actually play out as they're implemented. I'm not the appropriate person probably to lead the discussion on Oregon Promise and Oregon Opportunity Grant specifically. We would want, if that's the conversation you want, to make sure we get it scheduled with members of our Oregon Student Access and Completion team to be able to talk about their modeling and impacts and things like that. So absolutely, we want, if that's something that you want to do, then we want to be able to provide it. We just need to get the right people at the table to answer your questions.
And I will, in 30 seconds or less, piggyback on that comment and say, for next month's F&A meeting on May 11th, we do plan on scheduling a series of stakeholder presentations. We typically in the past, and will again this cycle, invite the Oregon Community College Association and the University Association to present their perspectives. We are going to invite workforce stakeholders and have a panel conversation with them. There are going to be 3 or 4 of them. We are also going to have financial aid work for our financial aid stakeholders, a panel of them, 3 or 4 of them as well. So we could have this conversation with those panelists, or we could carve out perhaps a separate time on the May agenda to focus in on this issue specifically. I'll defer, but those are at least 2 options in my mind. And we will also have the student voice. The Oregon Student Association will be an invited panelist for that conversation as well. So 2 options.
Thank you very much, Jim. Chair Cross, do you have anything to add at this point on this issue in terms of what we might want going forward?
No, I like the direction of the conversation, and I want to thank Ramona for bringing this forward as early as you have, because I think there's so many important issues here. I would like to learn more about Commissioner Hammond's idea and I think from the point of view of what is the underlying objective you're trying to accomplish, how'd you formulate that thinking? I don't think we don't need to do that today, but if you'd give that some thought for our May conversation, I just want to make sense of what the policy implications are, and of course, weighing that against Commissioner Devlin's comment about the political realities of the two funding formulas. I think we really need to keep his thoughts in mind. And if each is trying to accomplish something different, we need to be very careful about how we're approaching that. So.
And Jim, at this point, I know you and Ben and Ramon and Tom can have further conversation, but at this point for the May meeting, I think we are saying we would like more information on the programs and on the overall goals so that we're confident we're in the best position going forward. And I prioritize that before hearing the conversation of other stakeholders.
Thank you. Taking notes.
Thank you. Commissioner Gillard.
Oh, thank you, Chair Rowe. Could we please add a discussion, again, at our May meetings, whether it's the F&A or the full HEC, about the CSL and especially the recent impact of rising inflation numbers and how that impacts DAS's decision. And we all know the CSL is just a number, and we in higher education think it should be higher for higher education compared to non-higher education. And so I know that's a murky area, Jim, but if there's some kind of way you can deliver a primer to us all at our May meetings, I think that would be really beneficial to the now up to 15 commissioners, as well as any guests in attendance. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely, we can do that. We can do that two ways, and let me know what you think. For the June F&A, I will be making a series of recommendations around CCSF, the Public University Support Fund, and capital. And as a part of that conversation, I will be speaking to CSL and kind of what that looks like and how over time that has developed. And so we could have that conversation, but in an effort not to shortchange it, we could in May offer a primer, as you described, Commissioner Gillard, on that. And so certainly as a background, like a white paper, we could certainly put that material together for you and do it that way. Or we could also add it as a separate item to the agenda and spend a few minutes on it. So there are a couple of different ways we could do that. Maybe here's a thought. Maybe we can offer kind of a white paper background, post that with your materials for May, and give you a chance to kind of read through that, look through that, and then circle back in June. And then if you have any specific questions targeted to that, we could answer those then. So different ways.
Yeah, and again, as Ramona's pointed out and others know, in June, we want to be close to finalizing things. July, we don't have meetings, and then August is not perfunctory, but we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel, as Ben pointed out, at that point. And so I think CSL is going to be on a lot of people's radar. If the statewide budget is limited in the 23-25 budget, we don't know that for sure. And legislatively, of course, every legislature has different ideas every 2 years on how to dole out that money to different agencies. And so there's that dynamic too. But back to the CSL, I think that's on everybody's mind with this last several months of higher than normal inflation figures, and that affects our institutions, both universities and community colleges, tremendously, like it affects every household. And I think the better and clearer we present that, and maybe sooner, So maybe we have a white paper and a preliminary discussion, just very brief discussion, Jim, more of a primer than an actual discussion, I suppose. That way everyone's educated. And that's why we're here, education, right? That way everybody's educated, I think, and on the same base understanding, so that when we make intelligent choices, we have a common background from which we do that. And that's important, no matter what the choice is. So thank you, Jim.
Absolutely. Let me go. Sorry, go ahead, Chair.
Well, just to emphasize that, and I hope I'm not repeating too much, but Commissioner Gillard raises the very good point of the new members. So if student affordability is one of the things, is at the top of the list of what we care about, is in the top 3 of what we care about as a commission, then both giving them the background and the tools and helping them understand why it is so important to the HEC and what all levers we have to try to help with that. And Commissioner Devlin and then Commissioner Hayman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for the record, one of the things I would state about CSL is, along with the agency recommended budget, the governor's requested budget, and ultimately the legislature's adopted budget, sometime in the fall, and this will have input from agencies like HEC, but DAS will be meeting with LFO, the Legislative Fiscal Office, and they will be developing a CSL budget for the state. And in essence, one of the aspects of that, and just from my experience, both DAS and LFO tend to play down the inflationary costs on entities that are not state agencies. And you always have to push back on them. So in essence, that CSL budget will be 2 foxes in the hen house deciding the future of the chickens, actually, in a sense. So I think that you have to be able to push back on some of those CSL numbers. Now, they may be getting better, but I do remember a time when the legislature had to move LFO and DAS away from considering community colleges just like supplies and services, because what they wanted to do was to apply their basic supplies and service inflationary factor to the community college support fund, which usually was about 1 or 2%. So just to keep that in mind, that underlying budget, usually when it comes out, the CSL budget, and that's an internal document, normally I think it serves it serves a purpose of scaring people, because usually it comes up to a number greater than the amount of revenue that's available. And then becomes a tool to push back people who think things should be expended in other ways.
We're so glad you're a commissioner. Thank you. Commissioner Hayman, and then we will move on to the next item, if that's okay with everyone.
Thanks, Chair Rowe. We just wanted, this is new information to some, but repeat information to others. You will recall that the Community College Association has developed its own CSL calculation, which has proven to be pretty convincing to the legislature in the last 2 legislative sessions. And I just want to remind Commissioner Gillard that the inflationary impacts on the community colleges are built into that model. That, at least in the number that group develops, that will be reflected there. I think one of the things we should probably think about that is not included in any CSL calculation is changes in enrollment. And that's necessarily the way it is in the CSL, but I think we should anticipate that that may be part of the conversation when we get into the legislative session. We should be thinking about how we want to handle that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good conversation. Again, thank you very much, Tom. and Ramona for your good presentation, and thank you very much for bringing us in at this point. We appreciate it. Okay, Jim Pickard, back to you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we are ready for agenda item 3.0 now. We have all three panelists with us. I think this is going to be a great conversation. I don't want to oversell it, but I've been looking forward to this for some weeks now. And so in your docket item, I'll briefly say that there were some questions that were posed just to serve as guidelines, but this is free form, open conversation. Please feel free to ask questions. We want to make sure there's plenty of opportunity to do that. I will, in just a second, turn it over to Martha, and she does have a presentation that I will share and bring up, and I'll be working with her on that. So the three panelists in your docket item, they are named, and there is a brief bio for each in your docket item. And so with that, without further ado, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague Martha Snyder from HCM.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Thanks all for having me. I apologize if I was the delay or the alteration in your agenda. I must have been stuck in some metaverse because I could not get into this meeting, and I had to hijack my husband's laptop to allow me in. But I'm Martha Snyder. I am a managing director with HCM Strategists. We focus on issues of education policy issues, particularly with the focus on breaking down barriers and access to those traditionally underserved, and a focus on equity, with the ultimate goal being more equitable upward economic mobility for underprivileged populations. So I am going to just kind of walk through and give an overview of community college funding as you kind of start on this journey of reviewing your existing community college funding model and asking some of the questions that Jim pointed are in your agenda. Just a little bit of background. I have participated in the review, facilitation, and development of funding models in several states, both in the 2-year and 4-year sector, and kind of approach it through a lens of, how can the state best align and best allocate its resources in ways that align to state needs, student needs, and economic needs, and do so in support of the mission of institutions, either within or across sectors. So I'm going to just again kind of walk through some considerations for you, some of what we see in the national context, and then we will move on with our next presenter, and happy to answer any questions as we go. Okay, next slide, please. So again, this is just a quick agenda of what we'll cover. We're just going to focus in quickly on the state support for community colleges. I'll walk through a couple high-level examples of various state models so you can see them in kind of context of Oregon's existing model, and then leave you with some final thoughts. I do have an appendix that I kind of kicked some additional information just for reference, particularly around kind of the role of state finance, or the kind of the proportion of state finance relative to other resources, which is an important consideration in terms of the leverage that the state resources have in driving change. So, yep, next slide. Thank you. So just focusing in here on state fund, you can actually clip to the next slide. I do like to, yeah, next slide, Jim, thanks. I do like to always kind of start off. I know many policymakers oftentimes come, when you're kind of learning about higher education funding formulas, and certainly this probably is not new to you, but many policymakers kind of come with a K-12 context in mind. And certainly there are certain aspects of K-12 that we see translated into higher ed. But more often than not, there's important differences. Those two important differences being those first two listed here. The adequacy concept, we see that very well established in K-12. Kind of a lot of research has gone into understanding what it takes to successfully serve and fund different types of students. And we see that reflected in K-12 funding models. And then the very real reality, which some of you referenced in the earlier conversation, is, K-12 is oftentimes an entitlement. It is something that is kind of top line off of state budgets. whereas higher education or post-secondary finance is something that is considered discretionary and needs to be negotiated each year based on what available resources the state has after it's gone through all of its entitlement funding. This oftentimes means that funding allocations or funding formulas in higher ed are allocation models and not actually funding models. Some of these other things, obviously, there's other funding sources, in community college finance in Oregon. Certainly, you have your local resources that factor in, as well as in tuition and fees. And then in some instances, we do see higher ed funding formulas reflect the kind of concept of varying student backgrounds and funding or considering the different characteristics or the different needs of students and reflecting that in the post-secondary finance like we see in K-12. Next slide. So digging into kind of common formula components and community college funding, again, there's variations in exactly how these components play out across states, but these are the most frequent that we see either some, part, or whole of, and combinations thereof. Base funding certainly comes off the top oftentimes, typically a set amount given to each institution, kind of a doors open, lights on aspect of funding. Sometimes there's different considerations within this, be it size of institution, et cetera. Most common in community college funding is the enrollment based. Sometimes this is based on credit hour, sometimes on FTE, but certainly kind of the most common element includes variables oftentimes for different costs. And in some cases, this is where we see some reflection of different student characteristics. And then finally, the third aspect is the kind of progression and completion focused components. We'll get into a little bit more of this, oftentimes include additional weights or funding for success of different student populations. That being said, the range of what proportion each of these takes within community college funding ranges significantly. In some states, we see a very heavy emphasis on the student success and outcomes. In other states, we see more of an emphasis on enrollment. And in some states, it's almost completely base plus type of funding. Next slide. Great. So as we kind of, just wanted to, I kind of approach this from a principle standpoint. And again, like as we kind of work with states and consult with states on various, funding model reviews, often try to take a kind of principles driven approach. Believe that, a funding model that it should be responsive to changes in the system. Oftentimes, again, see this based on enrollments and shifts in where those enrollments are happening. Just kind of do a comparison here of the current Oregon funding model. Certainly the rate per weighted FTE and some of the adjustments that are made throughout indicate that your current system is responsive at least to enrollment changes within the system. A funding system that accounts for differing student needs. Again, typically this is a feature in states that have outcomes or student success metrics built in. We do increasingly see states, and you'll hear from California in just a little bit, but increasingly see states kind of add this aspect to the enrollment component as well. Currently, your Oregon funding model for community colleges does not account for these differing student needs. The FTEs are kind of across the board based on kind of agnostic of student profile or specific course. And then finally, a funding system that aligns with states' current needs or a more educated and trained workforce. Again, those many models that have some aspect of outcomes or student success place a priority on certain types of degrees or certificates. One of the important pieces here is that the data can be somewhat a limiting factor for more direct workforce metrics. And then finally, Oregon's funding model, does not have this differential funding. Just two quick caveats, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but it's these principles are relatively easy to facilitate through and to have a conversation about and to reflect. But certainly the more difficult conversations are around what exactly is the state role or the commitment in financing post-secondary educational opportunities, what is the right level, the right share, and then certainly the varying levels of resources across institutions and factoring in some of that adequacy conversation. Next slide. And with that, just a note on adequacy. I just want to note that this is becoming an increasingly common conversation in post-secondary circles. There's a lot of investment and research that is, investment in research around trying to better articulate adequacy in the community college finance space, building off of some of the work I referenced earlier that's happened in K-12. But for the most part, we don't really know what it actually costs to provide an adequate community college education for different students and in different programs. Again, this is where the field is moving, but it is an important kind of caveat to these conversations that much of it done is with kind of best guess, knowing that certain students require additional support, but what level of support that is, again, is more of art than it is science at this point. Next slide. So now I want to transition in to give a little more additional comparative context on a few other state funding models and how they approach some of those aspects that I just outlined. So next slide, please. First, just wanted to provide this quick example, this breakdown of just kind of, those principles that I outlined. And again, where Oregon sits and where some of these other states that we'll walk through sit. I'm not going to spend any time on California because Dr. Gonzalez is on the agenda, and certainly she is a much better presenter of her funding formula, of California's funding formula than am I. But just again, for a little bit of comparative context in terms of how Oregon sits to just a couple of other state examples. Certainly there's more out there that you can compare yourselves to, but these kind of reflect a good variation of those principles. Next slide, please. Just a quick, again, kind of comparison of those different components that I talked about in terms of base, enrollment, student success, and other. You'll see here, Oregon, not surprisingly, as you know, is primarily based on enrollment-driven factors, those FTE factors. California and North Carolina are somewhat of a mix. North Carolina a little bit more focused on the base funding and the enrollment. California having certain aspects of student success. And then Ohio and Tennessee being a little bit more heavily focused on those student success or outcomes components. Next slide. So just really quick on North Carolina. The reason I chose North Carolina is really because of its tiered funding model. It has a kind of tiered basis to how it factors in enrollments in different courses. First adopted in in 2010 with minor adjustments to those tiered factors in 2012 and 2014. Importantly, North Carolina accounts and has had kind of a historical state commitment to post-secondary investments, accounting for 64% of total community college funding, one of the highest in the nation. So that's an important context as well. Next slide. Here are, the components. Again, there's a lot more detail behind each of these components, but just to kind of give a simplified view of the breakdown. As I noted, that kind of the most unique aspect of North Carolina is really that tiered FTE funding. It really provides higher levels of funding for the different types of courses that students enroll in based on the alignment of those courses or those programs to state and workforce needs. They do an analysis and base it on those areas where there's documented skills gaps or areas that pay a higher wage. The unique factor here, in addition to that tiered aspect, is that this includes both credit and non-credit courses. So non-credit courses that have a high return or a high value have a higher tiered weighting. Again, an important conversation, an important consideration. And then the institutional academic support is really somewhat a base type of funding, and then a small percentage based on student progress and completion in the performance-based aspect. Next slide. Looking at Ohio, the funding considerations here, a formula that's been in place since 2014 with some adjustments since then, really just minor adjustments to address some aspects of the funding model. You'll see here compared to the more robust funding that North Carolina provides to its community colleges. In Ohio, the state is a minority or a junior investor in community college funding at 43%. Local resources are less of an issue here. There's only 6 community colleges that can levy taxes, and they are not factored into the state allocation like they are in Oregon currently. Next slide. This shows you some of the 3 formula components of Ohio's funding model. They have a cost-based course completion. So those courses that have higher costs, oftentimes those courses that also have higher demand, have a higher reimbursement rate. Success points, which are student progression measures, completion of college level English, college level math, and certain credit hour milestones, and then cost-based credential completions. Both the, and I missed an asterisk there should be an asterisk on the cost-based credential completions. Both the course completions and the credential completions factor in these access category weights of adult, low income, minority, Black, Hispanic, Native American, and academically underprepared. So for students that have one or more of those profiles or of those backgrounds, there's an additional weighting that is added to the point system within this funding model. Again, reflective of that principle of aligning to or recognizing that different students require different levels of support in a way certainly to reflect the equity imperative that many states, including Oregon, are embracing. Next slide. And then the final state I'll walk through is Tennessee. This formula has been in place since 2010. They actually have a statutory required review every 5 years. Again, they have 43% of community college or institutional funding comes from the state, and local resources are not a factor in Tennessee at all. Next slide, please. So as I noted, this formula was, first adopted in 2010. It's kind of considered the godfather of outcomes-based metrics or outcomes-based funding formulas. Was kind of the first of a more robust outcomes-based approach. And really it's been sustained every year since. You'll see here for the community colleges, there are 11 common metrics. They are counted for each community college. Each community college has to have these metrics reflected in their particular funding model. But the community colleges get to kind of provide priority weights based on the specific mission of that community college. Some community colleges, as you know, might be more workforce focused. Others might be more transfer education focused. And so they are allowed to have different weights based on that mission aspect. Again, similar to Ohio, there is a focused population or an element of accounting for differing student needs. They have three of those populations identified: adult, low income, and academically prepared. And you can see here the weighting system that applies for those students, again, to reflect the differing student needs and the differing supports that are needed to get them enrolled and through to completion. Next slide. This is a breakdown of that accounting for differing student needs. So again, I'm not going to walk through California's. We'll allow Dr. Gonzalez to do that, but I did want to include it for comparative purposes. When accounting for the supplemental or enrollment-based funding for priority populations, California kind of tops out at 21% of their funding based upon differing student needs. Ohio and Tennessee, those other two states that do have some reflection of differing student needs, at least of the states that I walked through, at about 13% and at just over 10.5% of their funding is based on or targeted towards those different student populations. Next slide. I also just wanted to highlight, I know there's oftentimes, various aspects or various components of that you're trying to consider as you're approaching a funding model and a funding model review. And certainly workforce metrics, particularly in the current environment that we are operating in with the noted skills gaps that many states are experiencing. An increased focus on how best to incorporate or support these within funding models. And again, we see states incorporating these models in a variety of ways. The most common is kind of that priority for different types of credentials. More refined measures are those on kind of return value or wages after a student leaves the college and enters the workforce. Obviously, the limiting factors there would be availability of data, and it also obviously adds a level of complication to any funding model. And next slide. Finally, as I conclude, I just want to give you a quick summary of the points to consider, as you start off on this journey. The review of your funding model, certainly not preconceiving that there's any changes, but just some ideas to kind of keep in mind or some principles. Certainly the continue to factor in the role and impact of local resources on equity and access for students. And the different leveling of resources across institutions. That's important. Oregon is one of just a few states that does factor that into the overall kind of picture of community college finance. And I think it's one to kind of continue to adhere to. I would also argue, that you kind of build capacity to understand adequacy. Certainly, as I noted, the research on this is not fully robust, but just have that as a consideration at the very least, that there is a differential cost for successfully serving different students or students from different backgrounds. And what does that mean as you factor that into your funding model conversations? The core set of principles, I won't go over those again, but those ones, just to kind of have as you're starting your formula review, asking those questions. Is our funding model currently achieving these principles? And if not, are there ways we can make progress towards advancing that? Certainly working or continuing to work as the commission, to articulate the state's role and advocating for the state's role of supporting community colleges and certainly the universities as well. And then finally, evaluating the other aspects that can influence community college finance and student access and success. In many states, dual enrollment is becoming a larger share of community college enrollments. What does that mean to the underlying business model of community colleges? And then that non-credit aspect and recognizing the role and value of non-credit programs that have high value or high return in the workforce. And so with that, I will conclude my very quick 101 of post-secondary or community college finance. There are some appendices, as I referenced, and I'll make sure Jim sends these slides around. And I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to that portion of the agenda.
Thank you very much. That's excellent background, and I'm so encouraged to just looking at other states. I've got reverb, don't I? Okay, I will mute.
I do. That the reverb might have been me, but I do see Commissioner Hayman's hand is up, and there may be time, Chair Rowe, at your discretion for a question or two. We do have Casey Meehan coming up next from Research for Action as our next presenter in the panel. So I didn't know how you wanted to do that.
Commissioner Hayman, can you make your question quick? And then we'll move on, and then we can come back for questions for any of the panelists.
Yeah, very quickly, and thank you. I may have read it wrong, but in your first or second slide, I think you indicated that enrollment funding was based on the most recent completed year of FTE, and I think that's not true. I think it's based on a rolling weighted average of the past 3 years of completed FTE. And so I just wanted to, maybe I read it wrong, but I just wanted to indicate that it's actually based on a weighted average of the prior 3 years.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that. And that was kind of my shorthand for at least saying that you do update the enrollment as close to current as possible. But yeah, certainly the weighted average is an aspect. There's certainly more detail as there is in any of these funding models than what is reflected in that table. But yes, very good clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, please, Jim.
Thank you. And Casey, I think we're ready.
Okay. I will try and share and drive my slides, but if that doesn't work out, I'll hand it over to you, Jim.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. We can see your slides, Casey. Thank you.
Okay. And you have the actual slides, not like a note slide?
Correct. It's the actual
Okay.
slide that's
Okay. We're working. Okay. Well, thank you, Jim, Madam Chair, and everybody else who is on here this afternoon for inviting me to be here. I feel the need to circle back and like revisit Jim's introduction of one of the smarter folks in higher ed. Like, I do not identify with that introduction at all. I look to those of you who are on this call as the smartest folks in higher ed, and my role is really just to synthesize a lot of what I hear from you all as policymakers, as state leaders, as institutional leaders, and as student advocates as well. So Anyway, so just wanted to be clear there that that's you all are the smartest folks in the field. So my name is Casey Meehan. I am a what is my title? I'm an associate director of post-secondary policy at Research for Action. Research for Action is a nonprofit education research organization based in Philadelphia. Our prior executive director, who very recently joined Martha and her team now at HCM, she was a state SHIO and had a deep interest in building out a really robust portfolio of higher education research. With a focus on how state policy is designed, is implemented, and received for institutions and students. So the work that I'll share today has been like the last 7 years of work that I will try and synthesize in about 15-20 minutes. And I'll add that as a mission-driven organization, our research also seeks to apply a critical lens to measuring policy effects and how policy is impacting and affecting underrepresented and minoritized students, as well as the institutions that serve those students. So with that, we'll kick it off. So I just wanted to sort of ground like where our work comes in. I know Martha sort of presented a little bit of a higher level overview of college and higher ed finance. Our work really focuses on outcomes-based funding, or now student success funding models. So I'll touch base like a little bit on the theory that we use as like a conceptual framework for our work in that space. I'll do a breeze through literature to date, and then begin to highlight some findings from, as I said, like the 7 years of study, and just conclude with some questions for discussion. So outcomes-based funding or student success funding policies, the way that we look at them and measure them, are policies that distribute state dollars to public colleges and universities based on sort of the following theory. That states construct policies that provide financial rewards to institutions to improve outcomes that are important to the state, such as increased college completion, and that institutions then respond to these incentives by adjusting their policies and practices to achieve the outcomes identified within that state policy, and that the shifts then in state policy and institutional practice are designed to ultimately improve student outcomes for students in the state. These policies have certainly evolved. You can even like the naming structure has evolved from performance-based funding to outcomes-based funding to now student success or student-centered funding, which has signaled how how the designers of these models have also sort of evolved in their thinking. But ultimately, moving from incentivizing a focus on student outcomes by attaching a portion of state allocation to measures of performance to, as Martha's presentation, was signaling sort of really embedding base funding with student outcomes and student success. So very quickly, just an assessment of lit. OBF policies vary considerably as studied in terms of both design and implementation across states and over time. Early research has, found negative effects to very limited effects on the effectiveness of performance funding in improving post-secondary outcomes. I will add that these studies did not address differential effects among different types and lengths of OBF policies. More recent literature has begun to look at that differential effect, knowing that state contexts are unique, state policies are unique. Not every outcomes-based funding looks the same or is received the same. So we have started to see studies that look at this differential effect of different models, and found that more robust types of OBF policies experience larger policy effects. And by more robust OBF policies, this research drew on the codification provided to the field by HCM around institutions that, state funding that has completion or attainment goals in their policy, has stable funding, and a large proportion of the outcomes are tied to base funding, that level is significant, that institutions, that it covers all institutions in either the 2-year or 4-year or both sectors, that there's differentiation of metrics and associated weights. There's inclusion of degree and credential completions as a measure, and there's the prioritization of underrepresented students. So states that meet sort of all of those categories being more robust, we've seen larger policy effects than states that are not meeting those categories. Recent literature by Amy Lee also found that institutions with a STEM metric did see an increase in the number of STEM bachelors. So there is like some movement that we're seeing these policies have on student outcomes. But most recently, Ortegas et al. In 2020 did a meta review of peer-reviewed articles on sort of outcomes-based funding research to date. Their meta review found that numerous studies indicate that performance or outcomes-based funding adoption is spurring institutional efforts to design and improve academic and student support services. However, literature is mostly showing this limited to lots of variation in whether these policies are having an impact on retention and degree completion in higher ed institutions. Some additional critiques of policies include that these policies provide institutions with a clear incentive to restrict access by increasing selectivity, and or that institutions may define outcomes that increase their funding without actually changing behaviors or practices that advance student success. I'm going to lead into sort of our research, but want to leave with a few assumptions or underlying assumptions behind our research. So taking all that, literature and sort of the theory behind outcomes-based funding models, our research for action really positions our work under a few assumptions. First, that there is no monolithic outcomes-based funding policy, that every state, every sector has its unique funding model. So it's hard to look, across multiple policies to see changes. We know that these models and, just general mechanisms for how higher ed institutions are funded often change. It's very iterative and they evolve with state priorities. In recent years in the outcomes-based funding context, we see a shifting focus towards student-centered or student success funding, sort of away from enrollment-based models, but certainly you see both models still existing, as Martha perfectly described in her case study examples. And we're also seeing a heightened emphasis across the field on using these formula funding models to advance equity. So a quick overview of RFA's research. Our first research study kicked off in 2014, where we conducted a 2-year, 3-state study of early performance-based funding or outcomes-based funding models in Tennessee, Ohio, and Indiana. Lots of interviews with lots of folks across multiple institutions and lots of data analysis and document review. And what I wanted to do here is, I have source documents linked, but I sort of went back and was like thinking through where are the implications for community colleges and what were some of the critical findings that we found specific to the community college perspective. So relating to formula design, we heard across all states that input during the development and revision of a formula can really help with deeper engagement and understanding from institutional leaders. We heard that institutional leaders certainly saw the connection between outcomes-based funding and student success funding implementation with, the institution's mission and focus on student success. However, relatedly, we also heard that while there was general buy-in to a funding model, support varied around specific components of the model and the metrics that potentially Oregon will soon decide. Relating to formula implementation, we also heard that strategic, in terms of like institutional response. So how did the community college sector and specific community college institutions respond to outcomes-based funding? We heard strategic plans were refined to focus on key student success goals following outcomes-based funding implementation. We heard that institutions started, increased investments in student success initiatives, aligning with the goals of their outcomes-based funding model. And we also heard several barriers that were inhibiting institutional response to policy and the improvement of outcomes. Those barriers included everything from insufficient recognition in the formula to specific mission and institution and student demographics. Of course, lack of resources and capacity to respond, as well as sort of attention around the competitive and unpredictable way resources were distributed within the model. Despite the outcomes or student success funding formula, as well as institutions in Tennessee, Indiana, and less so in Ohio at the time, still perceived that allocations were driven by enrollment, that given the way metrics were sort of based on total number of students, that there was still this push to have enrollment increases. So following sort of that first foray of outcomes-based funding research, we had the opportunity to go deeper and to look at how states were engaging with equity in their outcomes-based funding design, and whether institutional response perceived those funding models as advancing equity for students as well as institutions. So in this next component of work, we examined 6 models in 6 states: Kentucky, Indiana, New Mexico, Ohio, Oregon, and Tennessee. But before we get there, I wanted to just take a second to ground, our equity definition. So in the case of Oregon, you have a fantastic working equity lens that defines equity. So thinking about your own state's definition, that each and every learner will receive the necessary resources they need individually to thrive in Oregon schools, no matter their national origin, race, gender, sexual orientation, whether they're differently abled, depending on their first language or other distinguishing characteristics. Research for Action uses sort of a related evaluative framework for equity that's defined by meeting students, institutions, communities where they are, and allocating resources and opportunities as needed to create equal outcomes for all. So within that context, we set out to examine a range of equity concerns related to these models at the student and institution level. What student populations are identified and prioritized? How are different types of institutions recognized in funding formulas? And how is funding redistributing resources to historically underfunded institutions or historically and currently marginalized student groups? In this research, we partnered with the Center for Law and Social Policy, CLAS, to conduct a 6-state study. Again, 140 interviews across 13 institutions between less than a year. So it's an incredible amount of data collection, as well as, of course, document analysis. In terms of our findings, again, there's, and Jim knows this toolkit well, so there's a repository of information online that we call the RFA's Outcomes-Based Funding Equity Toolkit, and it has pages and pages of our findings. So I'm trying to roll it up into 3 slides. But the overall synthesis here is that policies that advance equity will balance a focus on achieving student outcomes with providing extra incentives and rewards for institutions, increasing outcomes for historically underserved and marginalized student populations. Models that focus on equity will provide adequate resources and support for institutions so they can be expected to increase student outcomes. And will also offer flexibility and performance measures that recognize variation in institutional mission and student demographics. We did have the opportunity to include Oregon as one of our states. We looked specifically at Oregon's 4-year sector and their model, but ultimately this work led to a case study on Oregon that's again on our website. But some of the findings from from your state in the context of Oregon's 4-year model was really around how to identify a model that reflected the state's commitment to equity. So Oregon's 4-year formula development process offers some recommendations for other states and systems to consider. We found value in how within the 4-year formula review process, there was a clear communication of an equity focus through guiding documents that identified why equity is important. There were guiding principles that prioritized equity. There were inclusive work groups that included members of each institution and provided additional supports to under-resourced institutions to ensure participation. There was transparency and data analytics throughout the process. And you all, if you have a different perception, this was based on the data that we collected, but certainly you could always push back here. But as an external evaluator, this is some of what we found. We also found that within the model, incentivizing institutions to reduce achievement gaps through including equity-focused weights for student populations. Within the model, again, there was support to reduce the gap in students by focusing on degree attainments, both for all students, as well as an extra emphasis on completion for specific student populations, as well as completion of degrees in specific fields critical to the state's future. And certainly there was mission recognition and differentiation in the policy itself. just a quick wrap up on where RFA currently lives in our outcomes-based funding research. So presently, we are monitoring how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted outcomes-based funding and SSF policies and funding sources. We are also exploring how, if at all, shift in funding models affected the level or type of support provided to sectors and institutions serving Black, Hispanic, Latinx, and low-income students. Again, this data includes document review, media scanned, as well as targeted interviews. Within the context of this work, we were able to conduct 2 additional case studies on states with driving and equity focus through their outcomes-based funding model. So here we identified Louisiana and Washington's model as equity-centered. Both states include equity weights for students based on race, ethnicity, as well as weights based on income, Pell status, and age. Louisiana's model also includes a cost factor to their funding formula. This is a relatively new revision to their model, but this cost factor distributes additional resources to public higher education institutions serving a proportion of minoritized students above the state average. Both states also have embedded its model into statewide agendas advancing racial equity. There are additional lessons from Louisiana and Washington that I thought would be helpful for this group as well. In short, statewide equity plans can help reinforce an equity-focused OBF model. A race-conscious OBF model can also reinforce a statewide racial equity vision. By investing in race-conscious and other population-specific equity metrics, consider examining how and to which level metrics can advance student and institutional success and equity. And lastly, in Louisiana and Washington, again, this is mirrors feedback from our earlier work that engaging diverse stakeholders and refining the model, particularly engaging minoritized student and particularly engaging sort of community voice around minoritized student and low-income success, as well as the success of institutions that serve those students is important to building out models that advance equity. I also wanted to share just sort of overall from across our work to date, there are other equity-related findings that essentially show up in each of our research studies, which is that policies that are directly tied to state completion policies and state completion goals are often perceived as more effective when there's alignment and sort of consistent signaling of state priorities across multiple tools. So that tool could be a state agenda, as well as a promise program, as well as a funding model. That alignment can be very effective in communicating where the state is investing in the areas in which it's prioritizing. And relatedly, outcomes-based funding and student success funding models that identify and align with strategies to increase credentials for specific student populations can be levers for state higher education agendas to garner more state funding for higher ed. So this was part of our theory that we've been testing under the, throughout the pandemic, whether states with outcomes-based funding models are able to better maintain and sort of leverage their model for funding. And we have a little bit of a signal that that's the case, but more of that to come soon. So just to conclude, as always, these are our research questions, but I wanted to offer them to the group here, building from, the past 7 years and 3 different research studies. This is sort of where we as researchers land, and I wanted to offer these questions for you all too. So can outcomes-based funding or student success funding be a tool for advancing equitable opportunities in public higher education? Can it be a tool for students? Can it be a tool for institutions? How do we know when these funding model policies are working? How do models signal state priorities? How do models offer both real financial incentives as well as signaling state priorities? And when and how can they do both? How do funding models evolve with state priorities as well? And how do you think an outcomes-based funding or student success policy, or perhaps to this conversation more broadly, like how may a funding model for the community college sector help close equity gaps for students at your institution or within your state? And so that is a wrap for me. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much. Jim, I think what we need to do is go on to the last presentation and then come back for questions.
Absolutely. I'll turn it over to Dr. Daisy Gonzalez for her comments. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Commissioners. My name is Dr. Daisy Gonzalez, and it's an honor to be here with all of you today and to join this distinguished panel. I do not have a PowerPoint because I am a recovering researcher, but mainly because I'm here to share with you California's story in hopes that it may help you make a very difficult decision and certainly help inform your statewide institutional leadership decision-making process. I have read a lot about the work that you are starting. I also had the opportunity to connect with staff, and I want to commend you for creating an intentional design and for committing to transparency and a robust work group process. That is not something that we had in California. Our funding formula came through a state budget process, through a governor that was terming out. And in that same year, we had a new funding formula, a new vision for community colleges, a fully online college, and a piece of legislation that required us to eliminate all remedial education. The good news is that it was all aligned with our new strategic plan here in California. And what we quickly realized was that the funding formula was only one piece of an ecosystem that needed to exist for us to achieve equitable student outcomes. I started my career in the classroom, and I'm committed to education because it transformed my life. I grew up as a first-generation college student. My parents' highest educational attainment was actually second grade. I emancipated from the foster care system at the age of 17, and I was an English learner until the 4th grade. And I became a 3rd grade teacher, a dual immersion teacher. And what I quickly observed was the aftermath of what it meant to underfund education in California. And it was a decision that I quickly made to return to policy. My background is actually in public policy, and I'm an expert in organizational change. Here in California, I have helped create frameworks for accountability and new funding models in K through 12, what we call the local control funding formula. A new funding formula for alternative education programs. It's actually something that we borrowed from all of you in Oregon. And as a researcher, I use the work that you were doing to redo our funding formula for alternative schools. And then, of course, the most recent implementation of what it meant to develop a new funding formula for California's community colleges, known as the Student Center Funding Formula. I currently serve as the second highest administrator for California's community colleges, all 116 of them. We have 73 districts, and I want to provide you some context because I know we're different, but we actually have more alike than our differences. We are a large district-led system, 73 locally elected districts with trustees. And like many other community colleges in this state, we are facing devastating declining enrollment. But for this state, we already knew that that was a problem. In fact, 42 out of the 72 districts that we had prior to this formula were already facing declining enrollment. 42 out of the 72 that existed at that time. We currently serve 1.8 million students. 69% of our students identify as students of color. 43% are adult learners. 47% receive free tuition. That's our version of the California Promise College program. And here in our state, that's an average of $39,300 for a family of 4. And in 2016, the California Board of Governors hired a new chancellor, Chancellor Eloy Ortiz Oakley, who then turned around and hired me. And we adopted a new vision for success, which called us to completely redesign our system. It called for 6 ambitious goals to make sure that every student from all backgrounds succeed in reaching their goals and improving their families, their communities, and in turn, eliminate achievement gaps. So very similar to your vision and mission. With a sense of urgency, those 6 goals called us to really address 6 key areas. Credential attainment, which called us to increase all completion by 20% every single year, and we have. Increasing transfer 35% to a four-year college or university every year, which we have, decreasing average unit attainment, and this is directly connected to eliminating remedial education. It set a goal to achieve this by the year 2027. This is the one area where we have not achieved that goal. Increasing the percentage of students who are career technical education students who are employed in their field of study by 76% by the year 2027. We actually met that goal in 1 year of implementation. So we had to go back to the drawing board and increase it by 10%. And then the last two goals, which are perhaps the hardest, to reduce all equity gaps across all student groups and to completely erase them in 10 years. And for California, that meant also addressing our regional gaps. We are a very large state. As we began to implement this new vision, we quickly realized that we had an outdated funding formula based on full-time equivalent students. Here in California, that's 15 hours per week. And then the state funds us differently based on credit or non-credit. So prior to this funding formula, we were only looking at one part of the student's journey. That's the enrollment piece. So for us, a new funding formula quickly became the missing link to redesign an ecosystem that could actually provide us with equitable student achievement. So the outcomes that we all seek. Our new funding formula calls us to focus on 3 different parts of the student's journey, and it is now connected to our Vision for Success goals. So very clearly, the 3 parts are this. Our new model supports cost of education by linking funding to enrollment. It also recognizes higher needs for students who have historically faced barriers to success and creates financial incentives around the goals that matter most for our students. This is what we call our momentum points, and there are 8 metrics that I will discuss later. When the legislation was originally introduced, it was a 60-20-20 split. Where we landed after our work group processes was this: 70% base allocation, so 70% of our funding is based on FTES. 20% is based on supplemental allocation, addressing those students who need a little bit more support. In this state, those are our Pell recipients, our California Promise Grant students, and our DACA AB 540 students, because that's who we serve in this state. And then the 10% are the success metrics, which call us to advance momentum points for students. With that, I really want to focus on 3 reflections and then head straight to Q&A. So 3 reflections that can help support your own development, your design, your implementation, and your evaluation. It's the same journey that our own board here in California went through. And what I will focus on is this: the data, because everyone wants to hear about data. What data did you use? What we did as a part of developing our student funding formula, which is the structures that we developed. And then what I believe is probably most helpful to you as commissioners. So what are the lessons? What are the warnings? So that's how I will proceed. My first reflection is this: in California, we did make an intentional commitment to advance student-centered design. But for you, you are in a unique situation where you have a new crisis, not that we weren't in crisis. And this is a unique opportunity to consider how a crisis like a pandemic, like a national declining enrollment in community colleges, can be a catalyst for student-centered design. But all of this work begins with your why. Prior to adopting this formula, as I shared, 58% of our districts were already in declining enrollment. As a state and as a system, most of our students never completed their education, which meant they were not completing degrees or certificates or transferring to 4-year institutions. Their time to degree was extremely large. In fact, our statewide average was 6 years, and most of our students were graduating with excess course credits as they continued their education. And lastly, our achievement gaps had persisted for decades, and they were worsening in certain regions of the state. We also know that during this pandemic, we have faced 3 new crises: ongoing declining enrollment, rampant poverty here in this state, and a reckoning with systemic racism. So for our students, this has been devastating. I got to join your meeting a little bit early and heard a little bit about your housing and food insecurity. We have that too. And what we quickly learned was that this pandemic could only provide us enough data to assess what we knew was in front of us, but it couldn't provide us the data to assess every single situation, which is why protecting our base funding was not a solution for our students. We needed to better understand their journey, and we needed to equip the right solutions throughout their journey, not just getting them through the door. So our why here in California always starts with our students. We are committed to student success and making sure that when they arrive to our colleges, they know that we believe that every student can succeed if we provide them the resources and opportunities to do so. We know that many of our structures, policies, and interactions really impact their experience. And so what I want to share with you in terms of this reflection is this. Our design was intentional when we were handed a policy solution, but we really needed to sit down and redesign it with statewide, local stakeholders. We quickly had to make compromises. And after selecting cutoff points, which is where we spent probably 20% of our time, the rest of our time was really focused on the metrics. What did we want to incentivize? What was important to our students? One key thing that we learned throughout that process was to create an independent oversight committee that would evaluate definitions for data, because few people could agree in a very short time frame. And then the other big piece were all of the other unknowns. How do we measure career technical education student success? Are there different costs of living, and should that be a part of our formula? Should we consider whether full-time or part-time faculty ratios should be added to this formula? Lots of questions were actually considered as a part of our independent oversight committee. After a 6-month process, the legislation moved forward, and it actually allowed for a 4-year timeline to implement, which meant that none of our colleges would face a financial cliff. Their funding would be secured, as we were hoping and also working to bring everyone along. And what I mean by that is, when you design, you quickly have to move to implementation. And that is the hardest work that you could potentially do. So my takeaways are this: as you move forward in your work, what Oregon can learn from us, we focus on 8 metric points. These are the things that are important to our students. Did you get me to a transfer degree? Here in California, the associate degree for transfer. Those metrics, if you did, give you additional points, additional dollars. You also get additional points and dollars if the students are part of our special needs populations. And what I mean by that are low income, first generation students in our state. We do have very strict policies. Proposition 209 does not allow us to use race and ethnicity in our decision making. And so we had to create a composite variable. The second thing is, did you get a student to an associate degree, an AA or an AS? The third metric, did you get a student to a baccalaureate degree? Here in California, 15 of our colleges were allowed to create baccalaureate programs. New legislation that we supported just passed last year. It will allow every community college in the state to offer a baccalaureate degree. The fourth one is earning credit certificates. Did we get a student to earn a career technical education certificate? Very important for us. We were in the middle of implementing a new piece of legislation. So we aligned it to transfer level math and English in year 1. That was a part of eliminating remedial education in the state. That gives you additional points. Transfer was huge in this state. We needed to align to our 4-year institutions. So there is a transfer component in our formula. And then we also needed to address career technical education students. So we adopted a 9 units or more, which will give you additional credits if you help the student get through. And then the last one is a livable living wage. Did we help our students get the right education that would actually get them a job in this state? So very important. As I leave this reflection, I think you have an incredible opportunity to focus on your why, starting every single meeting with that statement. Once you understand your why, the second piece I'll share with you is that there will never be enough data. In fact, data doesn't drive change, people do. You can have a phase of an exploration of new data, but that's not going to help the problem. Designing a formula begins with a deep understanding of the data that you do have, the interpretation of that data into facts, and then statements for how your current formula is creating barriers to student success. And then, of course, a list of the data that you would then need to actually implement and evaluate your new formula. And lastly, as you consider committing to student-centered design, it means that a formula is only one part of an ecosystem that needs to work in harmony with your statewide goals. My second reflection is that implementation is your next stage, and that's going to take you 5 years or more. We're in the middle of year 4 for this state, and that the reason why it takes so long is because change is hard, but equity work is even harder. So for us here in our state, we started off with a decentralized data system. That meant all of our colleges were collecting the data, but there was very little data being reported at the statewide level. So that became a big part of our barriers. In putting students first under the new funding formula, had we kept it, our colleges would have received $6.4 billion in state funds. Instead, after 1 year of implementation, we received $1 billion more, even though we had declining enrollment. Those 8 metrics helped increase student success outcomes. It has led local design, and it has helped us really identify who's not ready to deploy and create action. While our colleges were committing to, and I mentioned, eliminating remedial education, guided pathways implementation, the advancement of credit for prior learning, competency-based education, a new online college, all of that ecosystem helped us increase student outcomes. And in the first year of implementation, 24% was the increase in overall completion for our students, which is why I mentioned that this is only one part of an ecosystem, right? It's sort of when you want to change your family budget and you realize I want to be healthier, I got to make different decisions, or we need to buy a new couch. There are different decisions that you have to make. Here in our state, we quickly realized that when it came to implementation, our colleges were not ready. They did not understand the connection between enrollment, connecting our students to aid, which is what the supplemental allocation was attempting to do, and incentivizing the supports that our students would need along their journey. In terms of this new task, new challenge, we realized that as a board, as a statewide entity, we needed to really prepare our local leaders to support local exploration, local action, and effective practices. We developed a 3-part dashboard. Our first dashboard compares the old formula to the new formula, and it really helped us demystify the formula and address different myths and misconceptions of what it was actually meant to do. The second dashboard that was released added an analysis of local student trends, which was really important as our students and our colleges were working together to redesign programs and supports. This really helped our colleges think about who are we helping, what type of success metrics need to be advanced and which ones are not moving. And then we added a race and ethnicity metric, even though that was not necessarily allowed. Our colleges were asking to see that, to see how those numbers were changing. And then the last piece we just released, it's a district college planning tool, and it allows all of our college leaders, the public, anyone can go on there. They can pick a college, a region, they can play around with the numbers. And for our campus leaders, it has helped them plan overall multi-year budgets. And then most recently, we launched a virtual peer learning community with regional meetups, because this work was incredibly difficult. I don't think you'll face the same challenges that we have because you don't have Proposition 209. So in this reflection, I want to leave you with this. I think you have the ability to be more explicit and clear about the outcomes that you wish to see and materialize. While you focus on implementation, there will be a role for an external body to evaluate and to do it in a way that is independent of this work. That would be one recommendation I would make to you. And as commissioners, when the time comes to make difficult decisions, having an external body really helps you in your successful implementation of this work. Because not everyone is prepared to take action. Not everyone is prepared to act differently on a campus. And you you will need to design intentional professional development, technical assistance, and perhaps even visit colleges. That's the work that we started prior to this pandemic and that we are restarting. My last reflection, and then I'm going to stop talking, is that meaningful evaluation has to evaluate the now, but predict the tomorrow. Formulas are meant to evolve to advance student success. Your data will begin to signal an external barrier that may exist, and there will be many. So to prevent your formula from getting stuck, you're going to need to assess the now and the tomorrow, because this is about the ecosystem that you wish to design. Our data showed us that we were seeing increases everywhere over the 3 years of actually implementing this formula, while none of our colleges lost funding, right, because their base funding was protected over the 4-year implementation period. Since 2017-18, we saw increases in low-income student completion. For livable living wage, very important in California, we saw increases of 18%, 19% for those who are in our composite variable. So that's your low-income first-generation students of color. For the associate degree for transfer, very important for us, we saw increases in 33%, 35% for all low-income students, particularly for African Americans, 35% increases in transfer, 40.5% for Hispanic Latinx students. And there has been an increase of 69% in completion to transfer level courses. So that's our remedial education legislation. But it was a whole new world in terms of remedial education for our students of color. 89% for Pell recipients. So that meant 89% more students were actually getting transfer level math and English in their first year, and a 90% increase for our Promise Grant recipients. So as you think about your evaluation protocols and what this might look like for you, I'll mention that for us, the coordination with our 4-year universities and colleges were always a really challenging conversation. They needed to be a part of our formula so that we could incentivize policy changes at the statewide level. What our evaluation is showing us is that we still have a lot more work to do at the local level if we want to see further statewide success. Those with local governance issues, meaning our local districts, some are still struggling, so I will be honest, but our tools have helped them. We've also launched different partnerships so that we can ensure that our local labor partners and our board of trustees are working together and that they understand the tenets of the formula. And then our statewide oversight work group has continued to do their work. They have created a new definition for low-income students, identified new data for first-generation college student. Where we have not reached any consensus or made any progress is in how we might address non-credit courses and students. And so here's what I'll end with. As you think about your evaluation and your design, some of the barriers that we have found and that you may face are, in attempting to do this, there are several misaligned systems that impact our students, our colleges, and our systems. For us, the next step became addressing financial aid reform as a means to address the social determinants of student success. It also meant that we needed to tackle the misalignment with our 4-year partners. There's a new piece of legislation that I mentioned that allows all of our colleges to offer baccalaureate degrees. And then another piece of legislation that we supported to ensure that we could align to our 4-year partners, all in the same year. We also then needed to tackle the fact that we were forced to also implement guided pathways, a model, a framework that we adopted and now we love here in California, but there was never enough implementation timeline and resources. So we started to quickly advocate for additional resources to really design clear pathways, because that's what we were incentivizing here in California and in our formula. We also needed to ramp up our remedial education reform, which required us to do additional professional development. And then the last barrier is accrediting institutions. Here in California, we quickly learned that we can't design a new funding formula that is meant to create equitable student outcomes when we are asking our colleges to have different sets of rules and metrics that they receive their accreditation by. Luckily, we were able to work with our accrediting institution to align to our vision and to align their metrics to ours. And by the year 2026, our colleges will now have to meet new accreditation standards that are now all aligned. And that has been very important for the misalignment that was being created. The last thing I'll share with you is, as you think about your work from design to implementation to evaluation, there will be a time where you will have to restart all over again. And that's kind of where we are on year 4, actually. But committing to this work means that you are starting with broad engagement, that it is a means to designing, but it also means that when we shift, we are shifting actions. We are not just shifting words. So this is not about definitions, percentages, numbers, funding formulas. This is about action. And as you think about this work, I want to just leave you with this funding formula. And here in California, we say budgets are statements of values. You may say that there too. What we have learned quickly is that during this pandemic, our system became a really big family. And while there's still a lot more that we could do to better prepare our leaders at the local level, we do see this funding formula as a part of our ecosystem to achieve student success. So with that, I want to thank you and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much to all 3 of our panelists. Your expertise in seeing what others are doing is invaluable to us. Jim, before we see if there's specific questions, I'd like you to address, since we know there is substantial anxiety and fear and resistance to change of the formula within the community colleges, would you address for all of us how the expertise from these panelists and the information is going to be used with the planning committee?
Thank you. Yes, and I do want to piggyback and say that I really appreciate Dr. Gonzalez, Martha, and Casey for their time, for their patience in dealing with me, for their persistence in supporting student achievement over the years. They do really good work. And I do have to clarify that with the Community College Formula Funding Group, we did have our first meeting at the end of March, and we spent that first meeting talking about logistics and kind of talking about how to structure these conversations and how, focusing on the committee charge and work group charge and looking at that. We did invite them to this presentation. In fact, I did during the conversation receive a note from one of them who reached out and thanked us for the opportunity to witness this conversation. I don't know that I have a specific answer to your question, simply because this opportunity was really designed to afford all of you as commissioners a chance to hear some of this directly. Some of this same information we will share with the formula review work group. We have put together issue briefs with similar information for their benefit, and it is unclear at this early stage how this information will be used with the committee and how it might impact their thinking. I do agree with you that it's important to hear what other states are doing, and I do want to talk to them in a very objective way about just kind of some of these mechanisms, some of these components, and how they want to take it from there. And so really, I think I'll be asking them a very similar question. Having heard this information, now benefiting from this expertise, where does that take us? What more questions do we have? What directions do we need to explore with the work group? And so I'm looking to engage with them on that. So.
Okay, thank you. It might also be helpful to emphasize to them again, since there's been such concern, that the commission is serious about this change and in thinking that it can benefit Oregon and its students, the community college students, in addition to the system. And we are committed to it and deeply appreciative, of course, of their commitment and work. But since there was at the beginning hesitation in even going forward with this, I would just like it at every step to emphasize to the group our commitment to see this through and to have the best possible outcomes for the institutions and most especially for the students. We've taken quite a bit of time with this, but I don't want to eliminate any discussion or questions. Commissioners, if you have it, we can devote a little bit more time to this. Yes, Chairman Cross.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate this presentation and the thoroughness and different perspectives. And I want to just say that we just finished the work on the 4-year funding model and really realized I think significant accomplishments towards goals using some outcomes-based strategies in that funding formula. And we don't have that in the community college funding formula, and this is so we're at a moment of opportunity to consider that at least. And I guess my question, maybe this is for Casey, perhaps, is that every funding formula incentivizes something. And do you have a sense of what our current model that's simply based on FTE, what's the incentive, what are we incentivizing just by staying with that type of funding formula?
Well, I think probably either myself or Martha or probably Jim could answer this. But I think, of course, yes, you and I'll echo what Dr. Gonzalez said around sort of like signaling. Like, I think understanding your why and if you're incentivizing full-time enrollment, that's what you're incentivizing, enrollment. So in some ways, it's just thinking about are you sort of incentivizing the beginning or the end of a student's journey or persistence along the way? So I would just sort of push it back to you and think through, right, like the metrics that are embedded in the formula signal the state's priorities. So thinking a little bit about what current metrics are and what they might be signaling.
Can I just add to that a little bit too, in terms of, right, and this is some of this content I didn't cover out of the interest of time, but putting the kind of state investment in perspective of other incentives that are within the overarching finance model of community colleges. So in the case of Oregon, local, which is a more stable funding source oftentimes. But then the other piece that often misses or is out of the conversation is the tuition aspect. And tuition is also an enrollment driven incentive in many ways. So figuring out kind of that full picture, and then also what it is you want to get. Apologies, it's East Coast time over here, and the kids are getting restless. No, excuse me. So that's the base. Just look at the whole aspect, and then make sure that you're signaling, as Casey said. What are the other pieces that we want to make sure our state resources are supporting, both in terms of students as well as outcomes.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Hayman.
Yes, thank you, Chair Rowe. First of all, I just really appreciate all three presentations that I think have enhanced my understanding of things, and I really appreciate your emphasis on bringing us sort of up to the most current research that we have on these issues, because we've been looking at this for a while. I've been following the California work ever since its inception of 5 years ago, and this is a great update on that, so I appreciate that. I did want to respond to Commissioner Cross that our current funding model, at least as I understood it for 17 years as a community college president, it clearly emphasizes and reinforces access, and that has been a high priority for community colleges historically, and I think it should continue to be a priority in the future, perhaps balanced with other priorities such as equity. So, thank you.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Hayman. Commissioner Adams.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a newbie on this commission, so I may have a question that doesn't make sense, but in addition to the alignment of values and expression of values around equity, it seems that in Oregon, there's a lot of discussion about workforce readiness and some gaps in talent, especially related to children's mental health. And so I wonder, is there a mechanism, Jim, in the formula process to think about the ways that the formula can be in alignment with the direction that the state is going for workforce readiness and for real big gaps in workforce that we know we need more of outside of STEM? I could see the STEM incentives, but there may be some others there as well. So that's one question for you, Jim.
Certainly, Commissioner Adams. I think the current design of our formula does not include a mechanism specific to that. However, I think that is on the agenda for the conversation with the work group members themselves. And I think we're excited to have that conversation. You know, what could that look like if we were to really, want to focus on that and align it and make sure it's properly aligned, So I think we're over time going to have that conversation with the work group and going to get to a better understanding of what the possibilities are, what the potential is, and then go from there.
Any other questions? Again, this is so helpful. Thank you for your time and your expertise, and we hope we are able to continue to engage with you, but you have really helped inform our process. So thank you. And thank you, Jim, very much for putting it together. Okay, in interest of the chair's comfort, we are going to take a 7-minute break and come back at 3:25. And then if we can do the last item, we will be reviewing the public university tuition criteria. I think we'll be able to do that in less than an hour and perhaps finish a little early, if that's possible. So see you in 7 minutes. Okay, now we're going to get to see how many people we lost during that break.
I just want to thank you for your patience with the technology glitches. I promise you, we did practice and set it up before, but there were some issues, a glitch in the matrix today, so.
Our systems always do that to us, no problem. It's frequently out of our control.
I always think it's my influence on the technology. I touch it and it goes haywire, so.
Okay, we'll wait another minute and then we'll get started. For your reference, we are at agenda item 6, which is actually the last on our agenda today. And I think we're okay to get going again, Jim.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to briefly touch on a couple of topics related to the public university tuition increase criteria. That's the name of the agenda item, but really there's a twofold purpose with this docket item. I wanted to first provide you with and share a number of pieces of information that kind of help set the stage. I know for some of you who may be newer to this process, there's a lot of information in the appendices that provide historical information on tuition, what the universities are charging now, kind of recaps, you know, some of the differential tuition, some of the remissions programs, all sorts of information in the appendices that I won't cover in any extensive way, but did want to call your attention to them. You do also see in the docket item a table that just walks you through where we're at in the process for each one of our 7 public universities. There are a couple of corrections I do have to point out. For OIT Wilsonville, there's an extra period. It should be $10,527 for their proposed 22-23 tuition. Apologies for not catching that sooner. For OSU Corvallis, their board actually did meet this last week and on Friday and did approve a 3.5% increase for continuing students and a 4.5% increase for incoming brand new students. So they take a cohort approach with their tuition as well, and we will calculate the weighted increase and present that next month at the May meeting. For Portland State University, I do want to call out that last week on the 7th, their F&A subcommittee of their full board did consider an increase that was around 4%. The full board is not scheduled to consider that proposal until later this month on the 21st. And then for Western Oregon University, last week they did consider and I believe approve a 3% increase. So this is at the time of the process where there's a lot of meetings and a lot of movement on some of these decisions. And at next month's meeting in May, like we did last year, I'll present all the calculations that walk you through how we calculate the increase, what that looks like for tuition and mandatory enrollment fees, and share all that information. But I did want to spend a few minutes just talking about the tuition increase criteria, so which are listed on pages 2 through 4 of your docket item. But essentially, the commission is asked to weigh in on any increase in resident undergraduate tuition and mandatory enrollment fees that exceeds 5%. We have one institution, OIT, whose board last week did approve a 7% increase. So they will be seeking the commission's approval for that increase. And so these tuition increase criteria essentially just lay out, you know, how do we have that conversation and what do we base that decision on? And so these criteria have been, they've evolved over time. They started really back in 2017 for some of the longer serving commissioners, you may remember. And so the governor sent a letter that suggested some criteria, and some other stakeholders weighed in. And so we, in 2018, created a set of criteria, and as a commission, they were adopted. And then we brought them back to your attention, I believe, in maybe it was late 2019 and then early 2020 again. So these criteria have been considered 2 or 3 times and adopted by the commission 2 or 3 times. We're bringing them back to you for your consideration and your potential action today, because we do not have right now an administrative rule that spells out these criteria. And you may recall back in February that I laid out a tentative schedule for the F&A meetings, and I kind of penciled in later this calendar year, I think in October, a conversation around potentially drafting an administrative rule around the tuition setting process. So we're asking for your consideration of these criteria today, and then we'll do so at the full commission tomorrow as well. So I won't necessarily talk through all the criteria, but there are 3 main focus areas. And the docket item is laid out where we lay out the focus area, we describe why the focus area is important, we lay out very specific criteria for our stakeholders, specifically the institutions, that answer their question, their common question, which is, what do I have to do in specific terms to meet this criteria and hopefully receive a positive approval from the commission. So again, focus area 1, which is fostering an inclusive, transparent tuition setting process. Focus area 2, safeguarding access and support for degree completion by historically underrepresented students. And then focus area 3, which is financial conditions demonstrating the need for resident undergraduate tuition to be greater than 5%. And so that's all laid out in your docket item. And then I will also mention in Appendix A, because these criteria predated the passage of House Bill 4141, which is now codified in ORS 352.103 and listed in Appendix A. But there is now in state law a very specific process that each one of our 7 public universities has to go through every year, regardless of regardless of what their final tuition decision is. They have to create a tuition advisory body that has to include 4 students, 2 of which have to be historically underserved. They have to provide training on certain topics. They must provide meaningful opportunities for members of the recognized student government and other students to actively participate in the process. And so there's a very structured process in place as a result of that bill, which is reflected in our decision-making criteria. So I will pause there for questions, comments, issues, but we are asking for your action today on this item. And I think Ben has some comments. So,
if I may, Madam Chair, I
please.
just want to
Go ahead.
add a little bit of it. And longer serving commissioners have heard me probably say some of this before as it relates to the tuition approval process. I'll be blunt. This is a very awkward authority for this commission. One of the reasons for but it is assigned, it is a statutory responsibility. We can't avoid it. You are required to determine whether any proposed resident undergraduate tuition and fee increase greater than 5% at a public university is appropriate or not. And if it's not, they cannot adopt it, right? So this is a legal requirement that we have to at least consider and then decide whether or not it's appropriate. Part of the reason I say it's awkward is because your jurisdiction, your decision is yes or no. You don't have the responsibility or the tools or the authority to say, well, we think instead of 7%, it should be 4.5%. And here's what we would do in order to help them balance their budget under that scenario. right? Or you don't have the authority to say it should be, instead of 7, it should be 6. You have the authority to decide whether or not what they're proposing is acceptable, and if not, their board has to go, in effect, back to the drawing board and presumably come up with a proposal for a less than 5% increase that no longer has to come to the commission for approval. It is, again, I'll just underscore, having gone through this conversation with, over several cycles with various versions of this commission and with some of you, it is a very challenging and awkward responsibility. You're not the governing board of that university, right? So you can't rewrite their budget. You can't change the contracting decisions or other program decisions that their board has made, and you don't write their strategic plans or policies. You have this narrow responsibility to determine whether or not a greater than 5% increase is appropriate. That is part of the reason why you see these criteria as commissions have wrestled, as the HEC has wrestled with this in the past. It's tried to understand, well, if we can't make all those decisions, if we can't sort of redo the budget with a tuition level that we prefer, how would we sort of assess as a kind of an appellate body, in a sense, whether the decision that the Board of Trustees made to move forward with, in this case, in the OIT case, a 7% increase is appropriate. And that's why we've, that's reflected in criteria that emphasize process, right? What was the process that the board used? Impact, particularly on historically marginalized students, and so on. So I just wanted to frame it. I want to acknowledge, because I think especially for new commissioners, it's going to be tough, and I just want to like affirm the difficulty of this, because you don't have the kinds of tools at your disposal that you would if you were actually running one of these institutions. You are just in this case, an oversight body that can say yay or nay. You can certainly provide direction and feedback to the institution, to their board and presidents, and what you would have liked to see, rather than, what you've got, if that's your decision.
Commissioner Devlin. You're on mute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ben, in a sense, even though the commission's authority is only to say yes and no, my underlying belief is the reason the requirement is there is it was one of the, I shouldn't figure out a way to say this. It was one of the things that the legislature wanted when they gave the institutions sort of a quasi-autonomous role, because they didn't want them to have the ability to raise tuition without any oversight. Maybe it's a limited oversight, but they didn't want them to have it without any oversight.
And I think, and Chairman Cross or Ben, you can correct me, but I think that's the way the commission, as I've served on it during the time I've been on it, that's certainly the way I interpreted it, that the legislature was sending a message that 5% is a very significant increase for students and families, and that was seen by the legislature as a ceiling, and that's why it was passed to us so that we could say yay or nay. But I don't know if I'm over-interpreting that, Senator Devlin, or not.
Well, I think it was just one of those things that was added to the legislation to gain passage, because there were people that did not want the institutions to become sort of quasi-autonomous. So
yeah, I think that's
Cool.
right. And if I may, and I know there are other hands, one more thing I wanted to say about the importance of the criteria, the role of the criteria and the decision that you'll make today and tomorrow related to the criteria. These become then the tool that Jim and his staff use in order to make a recommendation to you in May of whether or not to, in case that isn't clear, if these criteria were adopted, or some version of these criteria are adopted today, this is how we will engage OIT. It drives the information that we gather from them, and then the assessment that we make in order to recommend to you yay or nay. So it's really key from a staffing standpoint. This sets our work plan for the next several weeks, engaging with OIT to bring the information back to you on whether we think they've met whatever criteria you establish.
Madam Chair, can I get a clarification on one item?
Yes.
Ben, on these new procedural criteria for the institutions, are those required in this cycle or in a future cycle?
Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they're in effect now. They are required now.
Okay.
Commissioner Cross. You're muted.
Yeah, I hit the button second time. I didn't need to. I want to just say how important I think the function is that we have as a check and balance across the system. And I've always regarded the charge of the commission as to represent the interests of all Oregonians as a balance to the institutions. And I think it does send a message of how important it is that costs be controlled for students and families. And I think the other thing, and I think what this criteria helps us with, is that it sends a message to the governance bodies and the presidents of universities that if they're going to request a increase over the 5% limit, they have to have a really good justification about why to do that. And we kind of tested that. I think it was 2017 when we went through a real messy process. It was hard, but it did establish the test that we weren't going to just rubber stamp requests, that it really had to be a well-justified, well-balanced request. And I do think that process is extremely important, and this criteria helps us get there in a way that's fair and transparent across the board. The issue when we kind of bumped up against this in the beginning, and we didn't really know how to do it very well at that point, was that it wasn't transparent. It was a moving target. I think it was frustrating for the university boards and presidents that it wasn't clear how to make the case if they needed an increase over 5%. And so I think we're much closer in much better shape than we were before.
I agree. Commissioner Adams and then Commissioner Hayden.
Thank you. I had one clarification question and then maybe a follow-up for Jim. Is the 5% a rigid number, or is it a formula that yielded 5% currently? So that's my direct question. Those 5% numbers are often kind of treacherous in that people assume they're connected to something rational, but as we think about what's happening in inflation, I think we're probably going to hit a buzzsaw, maybe not in this cycle, but the next one, just based on inflation alone. So that's one question. I don't know who the right person is to answer that. And then Jim, I thought I was smart. I read the materials and then I got to the last page, the chart on that page that I just cannot make sense of. So I was hoping that you could help me understand what I should be taking away from it as we think about this topic. It's the last chart on the very last page of the materials for today. Thank you.
Absolutely, Commissioner Adams. The 5% is a hard threshold, and we have a process because we look at tuition, and only for resident undergraduate students. We also look at all mandatory enrollment fees with one exception. There's a mandatory enrollment fee that the student associations set, and that is excluded from the 5% calculation, but all other fees are included. And so, and I'll quickly say that in May, the docket item for the May meeting will actually have the exact calculations, all the numbers, and we will lay all that out, hopefully in a reasonable, simplistic way, and kind of talk through that. So, but the 5% is hard cap, you know, not a formula-driven approach. I think the table you're referencing on page 18 is related to differential tuition. And so that table is an attempt to express that at the different institutions for different academic programs, the universities will designate certain academic programs as high cost and therefore charge a differential tuition. So for example, not to pick on anyone in particular, but you might have an institution that says, my engineering degree programs cost a lot more to deliver, so I'll charge, you know, the base tuition, but then I'll charge a differential rate on top of that, only for those students who major in engineering. So the table essentially expresses that delta as a percent. So the engineering students, for example, might pay for OSU 11% more than the English majors or the communications majors would, well, like my undergraduate degree. So there would be a base rate, then they would pay 11% more than that if they decide to major in engineering.
Okay, so thank you for that explanation. I did understand it after reading it through, and it gave me a little bit of heartburn because I thought that some of the funding model discussions suggested that some of these degrees, including some of the technical STEM degrees, are desirable. And yet we see that the highest incremental increase in per unit study costs are in those areas. And so I thought, how do I reconcile this? How do we think about the institution's ability to charge more for more expensive degrees? I assume it's because the professors cost more, the training costs more. I don't know what else would be in there. How do we reconcile that with the fact that we want more of these graduates in the workforce? So would love to hear your thoughts about balancing those two issues.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head in terms of pointing out some very complicated issues. Are in an effort to offer, you know, more context factually, our formula for the universities does include within the outcomes-based component a cost weight that does attempt to recognize the differences in cost. So those degree programs that are more expensive to deliver, they are weighted at a higher rate than lower cost degree programs. We also have a component called the area of study bonus, which you discussed, which is, so for those STEM programs, also healthcare, and bilingual teacher education, those are programs that as a policy choice, we've decided to add an additional 20% within the formula for those programs to really to capture that cost, but also to incentivize the institutions to work with students who want to pursue those majors, giving them enhanced, you know, wraparound student services, counseling, advising support, other programs. I can also tell you, just as a trend issue over the last 15 years here in Oregon, we have seen a 50 to 60% increase in the number of students choosing to major in STEM fields. So students themselves are making that choice as well. And I wish I had a better answer to, I think what your question is how do we balance those, right? If students are choosing to major in STEM, and we're applying a STEM bonus, and we're also recognizing already that increase for STEM, and then the institutions are charging differential tuition, how do all four of those levers come together? And what's the ultimate intent? And so I don't have a real good answer to that, to be frank. I can say that in many states, the formula is designed really to reimburse the institution for those higher cost programs that then, is a signal to the institution that you should not charge much in the way of differential tuition. But differential tuition in the last 10, 15, 20 years has frankly come more in vogue. When I was an undergraduate, differential tuition didn't really exist. And in the past 10, 15 years, we've seen across the nation, different institutions starting to charge differential tuition to recoup some of those additional costs. So I don't have a good answer as to how to best balance the state policy choices that we make with the institutional policy choices they make, and how to look at those in conjunction. But
Jim, are these figured into the the increase on a weighted basis? If PSU is asking for a 3.5% tuition increase, they have 4 different categories with substantially increased tuition. Is that in their increase that they are presenting to us? Are these calculated by number of students in each of the programs?
I believe the answer is yes. The institutions, when they do project for the next fiscal year, their revenues and their net tuition increases, they do consider and roll in all the differential tuition, their tuition policies. So yes.
Okay, if not, just double check that sometime, because obviously if not, it's the balancing question is even more difficult. Commissioner Hayman, I know you're waiting, but I think Senator Devlin, is yours go to this point or a different one? Your question.
Almost a similar point, actually, but you can go to Commissioner Hayman.
Okay,
first.
Commissioner Hayman, please.
So quickly, first, I'm in support of these, I think, guidelines and rubric for this. And I want to appreciate Commissioner Adams' question. It's a great one. It does get us into a interesting conversation. I also want to note that there are a number of community colleges that have differential tuition as well. And I would suggest that it arose probably because it happened before the state considered differential funding. And so now we're coming at a place where those two things might now interact in ways that when we as colleges incorporated differential tuition, we didn't anticipate. So it might be an interesting conversation. I have one real, kind of a detailed question. While this is way more important every other year than the other, all these institutions have to make their tuition decisions in the absence of having absolute clarity of the level of state funding. And I wonder if we give them any direction as to what level funding they should assume when they are making these tuition decisions.
We do. So this is an instance, a rare occurrence where we actually have an institution during an even year making a request of greater than 5%. Normally, these requests come in the odd year for the exact reason that you described, where there's a little uncertainty about the legislative level of funding. And so we do make every attempt to provide them with the clarity that we can offer around that. In this instance, we have shared a number of projections of what each institution will receive for the next fiscal year, so that they have the advantage of basing their approach, their approach on that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Devlin, go ahead, and then Commissioner Ayers-Probosky.
Yeah, it's just a very quick question. I would assume then that an engineering student at Oregon State University, when they're applying for financial aid, the university takes into consideration their financial aid based upon their higher cost of tuition. Would that be?
I would have to verify that with our financial aid experts, some of who may be involved in this conversation and who I invite to offer their thoughts in the meeting chat. I believe the answer to that is yes.
I
It
mean,
is
equitably,
differential.
it would need to be.
Yeah, different. So the financial aid decision making is typically predicated on, a cost of attendance, a COA calculation, and that cost of attendance calculation, I believe, does include, all the totality of tuition that the student, and it may be, to be fair, I think it may be an average calculation. So I think, I think it's included. To what extent it's included, I would have to verify with our financial aid experts. I do want to circle quickly back, Commissioner Rowe, to your question. So I want to be clear in that differential tuition is not a part of the 5% calculation. So when we try to ascertain, when we try to figure out, is what the institution pitching, is what they're proposing, does it exceed that 5% threshold? We only look at base tuition. We do not look at differential tuition or course-based fees or other types of charges that are non-mandatory. Differential tuition is not a mandatory enrollment fee. It only applies to certain majors at the student's discretion, right? So, I want to be super transparent and clear that when we try to figure out, is their proposal, does it exceed 5% or not? We do not consider differential tuition in that calculation. However, when we do have an institution who comes to us with a request to exceed 5%, and we start asking them very specific questions about what calculations did you make for your revenues for the next year? Did you include that differential tuition revenue as a part of your revenue projections? The answer to that is yes. We certainly expect them to include those differential tuition and other fee-based, course-based revenues, online tuitions, non-resident tuitions, all those fees and tuition sources we expect them to include in their estimates for the following year as part of the conversation, if that helps.
Well, then that would raise the question for me. I think Commissioner Adams has raised a very smart question in trying to balance these. And after this cycle, I think if we're both incentivizing by giving additional resources for these degrees, and then colleges and universities at will can have extra fees for certain majors, that I think we just need to figure out the incentives there and what's really happening and how we look at it. But for this cycle, I would ask that when it comes up next month, because since the only case we have is OIT, that we know what percentage of their students are affected by the 37% tuition differential in engineering and technology.
Yeah, Sandy, I'll jump in. Chair, I'll jump in and say that it's probably a lot of their students, right?
Because that's what I'm getting. That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
I don't think they have many English majors there. So, anyway, that's a pretty important question to us in this case, but we will make it a broader question. And I'm going to go first to Commissioner Ayers-Probowski and then back to you, Commissioner Devlin, if that's all right.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair Rowe. And one of the things that I would add is that typically the extra piece goes on the course tuition for that particular area. So if I'm a chemistry major and there's a differential tuition, it's charged when I take my chemistry classes, not all of my classes. And so just not to pull it apart a little bit. So maybe my major is 80 credit hours and that differential tuition for my chemistry classes might apply to the 80 credit hours versus the 180 credit hours required for the degree. So it's real specific to the courses that they're taking within that area area to earn their major. The second thing I would add is there was a piece that was asked about, well, the professors cost more. And that's really specific to institutions and how the institutions set up their collective bargaining if they are unionized. So whether I'm a criminologist or a chemistry major at an associate professor 5-year level, at my institution, you're paid the same. It doesn't matter. What matters is really going to be your rank and your years in service. And then there's a little bit that comes into play with zip code, but it's very specific to institution. And so it's not a one size fits all, much like we look at the overlying cost and what the base cost is. But I think one of the interesting things happening is, and I loved the graphs, Jim, thank you so much for making it so clear and really talking about inflation and what's happening, is we've also seen, because of the pandemic as being one of the biggest drivers, really shifts in enrollment. And so we're talking about next year as being this great year, and the Chronicle's talking about, enrollment's going up, and the research is really pointing to having a good year, but we have that murky middle. We have that transfers are down because students aren't ready to transfer because maybe they didn't start. And so we're going to see some real unevenness with what's happening with enrollment. And I hope that as we think about next year, the years after, the base funding, or moving into some of the newer parts of the funding model, that we really think about that aspect of the ups and downs and the swings and the ebbs and flows. And we're going into that uneven year, and a new governor and some of these other moving parts. And it could be the perfect storm if we don't start really thinking about some of those moving pieces as we prepare for the next go round. So thank you again for making it so clear. I know we've looked at these over the years, I don't know how many times, but one of the most heart-wrenching aspects of thinking about tuition increases, wanting student success. And right now we know they're being pulled in every direction, whether it's food or gas or all the moving pieces right now for them. Tuition increases are so difficult for them to manage right now.
Thank you. Commissioner Devlin, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a clarification on this last table. My understanding of this, and I believe this is absolutely accurate, these are the differential tuition for these programs, and in many cases, they've been in place for years. This is not an inflationary cost. However, do we know if any of these differentials have been increased in this year? Which would say there is an inflationary cost for them. Because I know OIT has had these factors for a long time. I believe OSU has had them for a fairly long time. And TSU, in terms of engineering and technology, I think they've had them for a fairly long time also.
Yeah, I want to 2 points. I want to appreciate the question, because you're absolutely right. This is not reflective of the percent increase just over the last year or two. Some of these are very long-standing programs, and this table was really included just to educate folks on this concept. I don't, off the top of my head, know in the last year what the changes to differential tuitions are, but we will certainly put that together and present that in May when we present the calculations for 5%. So we'll bring essentially another table that shows those incremental increases to those deltas just over the last year. So
thank you.
And I want to quickly point out too that Commissioner Adams' question about, like, for OIT, Allied Health, Engineering, Technology, that is about 40% of all the degrees that they award every year, to give you an idea.
So, Jim, again, since they're going to come up, I don't suggest this to pick on them, but since they're going to come up, the level of transparency with potential students for that, in terms of website and what students know even before they declare a major, maybe, going there, and then do they have enough warning that, oh, actually for those classes, your tuition's going to be more than a third higher? And if we have input, if there's anything affecting the criteria that you make recommendation, the gadget recommendation anyway, that can be applied to this, I think we'd like to hear that when it is presented to us.
Will
And
do.
certainly, I'm sure that the administration there will be willing to address it with us. But that is significant. And Commissioner Adams, I did not mean to cut you off. If I did, since it's your question.
No. This technology platform is so awkward. I do think Commissioner Goulart has been waiting for a while, so I'm happy to get to the back of the queue and ask my follow-up question later.
Well, if it's a follow-up question, please go ahead, Rukaya, and then I'll follow you.
Well, I tapped into the chat. What criteria should we center in thinking about in approving or not approving a 5% increase? Do we focus on the institution and its needs, or do we center the students who will be financially impacted by it? What do you center in thinking about whether or not to approve it?
If I may, Jim, I want to take a stab at this excellent question, because I think it's a good way of kind of summarizing the draft criteria. And commissioners can read it and reach their own conclusion, but I would describe the proposed criteria, which the commission has attempted to apply in the last cycle, as really being student-centered. You see very little here in the criteria about the necessity of the tuition increase for institutional purposes. It really is focused on what this means for the student, including the extent to which a tuition increase of greater than 5% may be used some of that additional revenue may be used to support underrepresented and low-income students. As most or all of you know, these tuition increases, while we look at them and the statute requires us to look at them as a sort of relatively simple across-the-board increase, as your discussion of the differentials pointed out, every student, increasingly, every student has a different tuition. Because not only are some paying tuition differentials, but others are receiving tuition remissions, right? Which we're again, it's one of these tools that we're not exercising at all, right? That's not a tool that we're using, but it is a tool that universities are using, and they may be able to demonstrate, in order to meet one of these proposed criterion, that they're actually using additional revenues to shield low-income students from tuition increases, right? And the criteria really does try to center the student experience of this, or they may be using tuition revenue in order to create levels of support, increase the likelihood that a student completes. And that, may be part of how they make the case and satisfy the criteria that, again, in direct response to your question, are really an attempt to be about the impact on students, not the institution as an entity.
Commissioner Goulart, I apologize. My toolbar covers your hand raised, and I did not know it was raised until Commissioner Adams mentioned it. So I apologize.
Well,
Please go ahead.
No problem. And thank you, Commissioner Adams, for your kindness. Ben, you stated that very well. Remember, there's also differential tuition and a discount. Many places, if you take a late afternoon or evening class, there's a certain discount to tuition, just to add more problems to the calculation. But what I wanted to mention was what some of you went through, what we went through